You are listening to Mind Pump's The Third Rail with Sal DiStefano. Normally I host the Mind Pump podcast, but I like to talk about subjects that don't have anything to do with fitness that are extremely controversial. So I'm going to be doing a series of episodes where I talk to people about third rail topics, religion, politics. Now in this episode, I'm talking to Bret Weinstein. Now he's a biologist and evolutionary theorist. He was a professor at Evergreen State College. He caused a riot over there back in 2017 because he refused to stay home during a day they said that no white people should show up to the school. In fact, people were looking for him to physically assault him back in 2017. This put him on the intellectual dark web list, sharing the place with people like Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin, Jordan Peterson, and many others. He is a self-proclaimed liberal, so he does tend to vote Democrat, but at times he's at odds with the liberal left, especially right now with the woke movement. So him and I talked a lot about what's happening right now, the speech censorship, what's going on with tech, the voter fraud issue that is or may not be happening with the current election, and the distrust in the current system and what that may spell for the future. And at the end of the episode, he actually gives us some tips on how we can better prepare ourselves for what may happen, or just prevent ourselves from being so polarized and extreme in what seems to be an age of everybody feeling extreme and polarized. So I hope you enjoy this episode. All right, Bret, thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So real quick, you've been placed in a category known as the intellectual dark web. Like, what is that? What does that mean?
What does the intellectual dark web mean? Well, the funny thing is that term was coined by my brother, Bret Weinstein, and it was coined ironically. It was designed in some sense to bring out people's worst taunts right away and cause them to spread the message as they did so. But to the extent that the intellectual dark web is something real, it is a loose collection of people who are of a mindset that it is more important to establish ground rules for honorable conversation than it is to reach agreement on the important topics of the day. That's one way of thinking about it. I've also heard it described as a protocol for interaction between people, and I think there's something to both of these ideas. Excellent.
Now you are a self-proclaimed liberal. You tend to vote Democrat. I guess you identify as more liberal on the political spectrum, if you will. And in that group of people who are in the intellectual dark web, you have people like you, and then we have someone like Ben Shapiro, who would be categorized more on the right, more conservative, or Dave Rubin, for example. Like, how can that be? Why are there so many different people with potentially with different opinions on how things should be done, but you're all in this kind of same category? What is it that you all have in common?
Well, I think there's actually a larger question here, which has to do with the shift in what left and right actually mean. And what I would tell you is that since I landed in the public eye, I've interacted with a great many conservatives, and almost all of the people on that side of the political spectrum that I've run into are in basic agreement with liberals about the structure of society that we want. We disagree typically over how close we are to that ideal, but we all want a fair system in which everybody has the tools to access the marketplace and to thrive there. And so anyway, I guess part of the answer to your question is the gap between what liberals and conservatives see and desire is fairly small. And once you realize that, it actually makes interaction across those lines fairly easy. Now, both left and right have a fringe that is a very different story. And we are, in some sense, being driven to the center to discuss what to do about these fringes and their control over dialogue.
Now, what's weird to me, Bret, is that over the last, maybe even 10 years, maybe even a little more, it seems like just discussing things is in some circles not good. It's banned. I mean, you go back, 50, 60 years, and Berkeley was, for example, was where people would protest for free speech. All of a sudden now, I mean, in your example, for example, just speaking out against maybe what may be popular on the college campus, people were rioting. They were trying to fight your ability to talk. What happened? What happened to where for a long time it was, let's fight for our right to speak out and to argue and debate, and now it's like you can't even talk.
Well, what happened is complex, and it has a number of different facets. I think the novel features of the online environment have created a great deal of noise that has entered our conversations. But it's also true that politically oriented forces have utilized leverage in order to shift the conversation. And what this has caused is, I think, a broad-scale failure of our belief in analysis. That is to say, it used to be relatively common for people to gather in order to figure out what was true, and now all of the landscapes where one would hope to do that have been politicized. And so it's a battle over power rather than what is correct. And the IDW, among other things, was a reversal of those priorities. It was more interested in figuring out what was true than winning arguments.
Now, at the moment, you mentioned the two fringes, and both, I guess, political sides definitely have their extremes. Which one at the moment is to you more of a threat to our ability to have this debate discourse? Which one seems to be more of a threat to speech? Well,
I do have particular concerns about the hegemony of what is traveling on the far left. This woke revolution is a huge danger to the very foundation of the republic. But I am also quite concerned that what it's going to do is invigorate the ethno-nationalist right. And so, in essence, the two together are the biggest hazard, and each one will play its role, amping up the other and delivering justification for a more and more polarized discussion.
Yeah, what I've said to my friends is that, because I agree with you, I do see right now that it seems like the extreme left has a little bit more power in the media, a little bit more influence, but the extreme right can present themselves as patriotic. They can drape their extremism with a flag, and I feel like that would sell more, and I feel like people would be more accepting of that, and it could be potentially more dangerous. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I would zoom out a little bit, and I would say what I see on the left is an establishment that is playing with concepts on the far left, not because they believe them, but because it's politically expedient. And the problem is, I don't think that they are correct in what I imagine is their assessment that they can control that fringe element. In other words, they're going to empower it in order to gain power in our system and lose control of it because it's wielding some very powerful tools in public discourse. So when that happens, and that is happening already, it is going to continue to topple institutions that we are depending on. And because it's toppling them in a way that is hyper racially aware, for example, it is going to drive whites together by demonizing them. And that is exactly what it is that fuels the ethno-nationalism on the right. So the left is going to create the monster that they claim haunts the landscape, and that is indeed a dangerous process.
Do you see the kind of, and I don't think that the left has, they definitely haven't, I guess, supported some of the extremism on the left, but it does feel like at some points they're a little silent about it. Do you think that's going to change after this election is decided? Do you think that they kind of allowed it a little bit, like you said, for political expediency? And is that going to be a hard monster to, once you've unleashed that, do you think they'll be satisfied if let's say Biden officially does get declared president?
Oh, of course not. No, they won't be satisfied because this is about power. And so having discovered how much power they have, the idea that they're going to stand down and go home is absurd. What they're going to do is probably change how they wield that power. But the other thing to recognize is that the elites, in particular the elite rent seekers who have taken over the DNC and are steering the Democratic Party, they are in effect facing the consequences of decades of influence peddling that have left the public with the sense that the governmental structure is rigged against them, which it is. So that frustration is spilling out into the streets. And in effect, I believe the DNC and other mainstream elements of the left are attempting to divert attention away from those who captured the governance structure. And effectively, they're going to point the woke movement at other citizens who, in general, will not have been responsible for the corruption of the government. And that this is effectively a not so clever way of avoiding the chickens that have come home to roost. But no, there's no way that they're going to successfully control it, because the tools of stigma that the woke movement is using are so powerful that they really do allow takeover of institutions. We saw it at Evergreen. We're seeing it in the tech sector. We're seeing it in media. So, I don't know what it is that halts this, but it's not going to be the cleverness of elites.
What makes these methods so alluring? I mean, I think, historically in the past, it was dividing people by class and using that as a tool to, bring in communist revolutions, for example. It seems very Marxist, although most people are probably not aware that it's got Marxist kind of almost like following a Marxist playbook, if you will. What makes it so alluring? Why is it like a virus that spreads? I would feel like the 20th century alone would make us look at it and say, okay, that's not a very effective thing. This could get out of hand, and this is poison. Why does it keep coming back?
Well, you used two different metaphors in there. You used the virus, which I would say is the accurate one, and you said it was alluring, which I don't think it is. I don't think anybody finds the idea of racial segregation alluring at this point. I think we all rightly find it repellent. But the game theory that exists in the context of accusations and stigma like racist, that game theory supports people speaking as if they believe in the claims of the woke movement. And the reason is pretty simple, which is the power to wreck your life, to get between you and your livelihood, to drive your social group away from you. That power is very real. And basically, people are offered a choice. Do you wish to pay that price and make the tiniest contribution to fighting this movement? Or do you wish to pretend to believe things you don't, say them out loud, so effectively surrender, and then they'll move on to the next person. And so what you see is a lot of people claiming to believe things that they couldn't possibly believe.
I see.
My claim is effectively everybody is too smart to see through a lot of the claims of this movement. But what people don't realize is these very foolish claims are coupled with a very smart and powerful strategy. And you're right, it does have Marxist overtones, or maybe that's even too mild. It is in many ways Marxist, and many of the people who are advancing it would tell you the same thing.
Yeah, it seems like they have, and this is the part that is most Marxist, as changing the definition of things. Racism used to mean something, and now it means just because you're in the system and you're not calling yourself a racist, you're racist, or you're using a word that these days has a different definition. You have no idea of its roots, but because you used it, now you are considered racist. Or if you just disagree with someone's policy, What is it with this changing of definitions? Is it just to broaden the amount of enemies or political opponents that they can attack with it?
It's all strategic, and again, much more sophisticated than people imagine. It became sophisticated through an evolutionary process where things that were effective spread. And so what we are seeing is the collection of all of the little tricks that worked, all of the Kafka traps that were impossible to evade. So, the definition of racism, if you try to reverse engineer it from how it's applied, is very simple. Racism is anything that isn't what we told you, right? If you show evidence of independence of thought, that will be portrayed as racism. Now, never mind that everybody is too smart to believe that. It doesn't matter what they believe, because what matters is what they do, and that people will act as if something racist has occurred is, effectively the whole story.
Now, do you think that using these terms and these strategies is going to start to lose power because they're been used so much? In other words, here's an example of what I'm talking about. Trump actually gained a decent percentage of minority votes the second time around. He got more of the black male vote than he had before, and it was a pretty good number for a Republican. Huge percentage of the Latino vote, especially among Cuban Americans and Venezuelans, and in Florida, that's what gave him Florida. And he's been attacked as being this super racist, the most racist president of all time. Is it losing its power because it's being used so much?
I wouldn't say it's losing its power. I would say you can see in that data, and I agree, it's very interesting, those patterns. You can detect that there is something about it that polarizes even within communities that we are told are all on board with it. And it's not surprising. I think actually Trump's strong numbers in these demographics say nothing about Trump. They are true in spite of Trump. But the point is, if you were a member of one of these minority groups and you were told that you're failing, and you're failing because there's rampant racism, well, that's not a very positive message, especially for somebody who feels like, yeah, what I want is a shot. I want to compete on a level playing field. And if I'm given that opportunity, I'll win, right? Somebody who has that mindset is going to be repelled by somebody who's telling them you're helpless and it's not your fault. And so, yeah, of course, they're driving lots of people away, but they're also bringing lots of people in. And the whole thing in the end is unstable, right? When this ideology wins, it's going to fall apart for exactly the same reasons that it always does in every other Marxist context, which is that game theoretically, the structure that would be necessary to preserve the cooperation just simply isn't present. So there will be a battle over the spoils and it will come apart. And the problem is, in the meantime, it will have wrecked an incredibly vibrant and productive system in which, I agree, things were not fairly distributed. But that vibrant system is something that should be protected. And to the extent that what it produces is badly distributed, then that is the issue to be addressed. And it has been. And we've all understood that for at least decades.
Yeah, I think the part that worries me the most is that the conversation doesn't seem to be anymore that the other side is just wrong. It's now become that the other side is evil and bad. And, if somebody's truly evil, you don't debate them. You punch them, you knock them out, you get them out, because there's no debating or discussing with the other side. And it seems now that it's not about being wrong. It's just, you vote for that guy, you're evil. Oh, you voted for that guy, you're evil. And to me, that's just patently false. Society would not exist if the half of the country was, truly evil. And one thing in particular really terrified me. And I know you actually had an issue with this, and this is what puts you at odds sometimes with some of the elements of the current Democratic Party. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did a tweet, where she was basically talking about archiving Trump supporters or people who were part of his campaign to punish them in the future. There was also this website called the Trump Accountability Project, and I'll read off their own website. It says, "Remember what they did. We should not allow the following groups of people to profit from their experience: those who elected him, those who staffed his government, those who funded them." How do you feel about this?
Oh my God, it's a catastrophe. Now, I will say, Trump has done his share of this sort of thing. You know, his lock her up business in 2016 was of the same flavor. And my sense is that there is a basic agreement that we, within tolerances, leave the other side alone when they lose, and we allow democracy to address this issue as a matter of checks and balances rather than persecuting individuals. Now, I will say I pushed back on that tweet, and I got a lot of pushback for doing so because you can't prove that what was said was actually an invitation to persecute individuals extrajudicially, though I think pretty clearly that's the implication of the tweet. I wouldn't even call it plausible deniability. I would say there is implausible deniability there. But nonetheless, for those who are looking at the 2020 Rorschach test and seeing one side as righteous and the other as evil, they can read something perfectly innocent into what was said. And it's a fairly high bar for those of us who are outside of the fray to say, you know what? There are certain things we don't do. And one of them is wield these tools against other Americans because they disagree with us.
Yeah, when I read that tweet, I was like, man, that is really scary because and going back to some of these polls that seem to be, when they're trying to predict how many votes one side will get or the other, they're now starting to bake into the numbers that some people are just afraid to say who they're going to vote for, which is very strange. What a weird situation to be in America, the country that has the most protected speech of all countries, that people are even afraid to say what their opinions are. It's a little terrifying. The other thing that worries me a little bit is, and we've had this before, where if one side wins, the other side accuses the other side of cheating. In 2016, it happened when Trump won. Russia made him win, and let's go after this. This narrative for 4 years, and now we're seeing Trump say it that Biden's projected to win, but it's only because he cheated. What are the potential? How damaging could this be for us if we continue down this path every 4 years?
Oh, catastrophic! And in fact, it could be catastrophic this time. This is the worst outcome we could face, worse than either of the parties winning in a way that couldn't be easily contested. So it's hard to know what to do. Most people are compromising their own credibility by effectively making arguments that they only are making because they are convenient to their side. And very few of us are in a position to look out for the well-being of the republic. And I think it's very clear the well-being of the republic depends on us protecting our electoral system. If there's fraud and we let it go, that is an absolute catastrophe. So we need a system in which not only is there no fraud, but we're in a position to know that for certain.
Now, I know that in the past, certain Congress people and politicians have advocated for voter ID, saying that it helps with fraud. And the argument against it is that it's suppressing minority votes. Do you think that this current situation supports voter ID laws, maybe to prevent stuff like this from happening, or do you think it doesn't matter?
Well, let's be clear. I can't say for sure, but my sense, having been watching the situation for decades now, is that Republicans have been playing a game with the hazard of electoral fraud. They have been pretending that it was likely that individuals were going to find a way to vote more than once or something like this. This is nonsense. I'm not saying it never happens. Obviously, it's going to happen in any election above a certain size. But does it ever happen enough to matter? the chances are very low that that kind of fraud would, because the penalty for engaging in it is high, and the ability of one individual, even if they worked at it full time, to file enough fraudulent votes to change an election is just vanishingly small. So there won't be a lot of individual fraud. And to the extent that there is individual fraud, it's unlikely to matter. And I think that's the place where voter ID is most likely to be effective. What we need is a system that is modern, that is uniform in some sense. Part of what we face, the problem, is that all of the states are free to do their own thing, and they all do something somewhat different from each other. And this makes for chaos. But we also need a system that is at least partially electronic and verifiable. Now, this is a high bar to meet. There are lots of obstacles, and many people correctly fear that if you built an electronic system, it would be ripe for a massive fraud. So it has to be built very carefully. And frankly, it probably can't be entirely electronic. It needs to have a paper component in order to guard against that. But a system in which votes were registered through something like an app, where the code that the app is built from is open source, where the votes are auditable, is going to be essential going forward, so that we don't face this every single electoral cycle. And for what it's worth, we spotted this hazard months ago, and we in the Unity movement tried to generate a prize that would have incentivized the rapid production of such an app. And our thought was, ordinarily, there's no way to get such a thing adopted by 50 separate states. But after the electoral catastrophe that was very clearly headed our direction, we thought the openness to adopting it might be there. And if the app was ready, we hoped that it would be adopted at that point. Unfortunately, we were unable to generate the prize, so the app doesn't exist. And that means that in our current situation, it isn't there to reach for as a solution for next time.
Yeah, the one fear I would have with that, and I think you're addressing it, is that something so centralized would be easier to manipulate versus this kind of decentralized, however unorganized, kind of scattered system. But it sounds like you guys have kind of tried to work that out.
These are formal problems, and the fact is there are other formal problems that have been solved. The cryptocurrency community has figured out how to make a system that is robust and consistent. We also see this with financial transactions. We have a system of electronic transactions that is not readily gameable. And so I'm not arguing that it's simple. It isn't. And it has to be dealt with very carefully. And one has to be, frankly, open to the possibility of, as I said, a hybrid system that is, part paper, part electronic, and that the combination negates the hazard. But yes, we do believe it is possible, and it is certainly time.
Yeah, I mean, the logical side of me is saying that would be amazing. I would love that. And then the other side of me says, well, geez, they would just have to sow some doubt into pretty much anything that is put forward. That's what they're doing now, is just make people feel doubtful. Do you think we could walk back from this distrust in our system? Do you think that it's possible? Do you think we're kind of going down this hill and speeding up, and it's not going to change until it crashes?
Yeah, that's the harder part of the puzzle, to be sure, is that the sense that we are one people who are in this together for better or worse, and that we ought to protect the ship on which we are traveling. That sense has been lost. And it's quite clear to me that we will discover that it was the truth at the point that we have destroyed the ship and we are all out there adrift with nowhere to go. The question is, can we get people to preserve the ship while it's still afloat? And I certainly hope the answer is yes.
Yeah. What role do you think, in terms of everyone's mental state, do you think that the coronavirus has played? I know historically, when there's been pandemics and lockdowns, you see outbreaks of riots for whatever reason because people are pent up at home. Do you think that has played a role in just this fear and angst and anger with each other's side. We saw record numbers of votes. Part of that's probably mail-in. We've seen lots of riots. Do you think that just psychologically speaking has played a big role in all this?
Yes, it's definitely at least accelerated processes that were already unfolding. It's also possible that it has created some phenomena, but I really believe that it is almost literally the case to say that we are watching a collective psychosis, that we are watching people lose their grip on reality. They are lashing out at phantoms. They are exhibiting a kind of paranoia about other citizens that really has the hallmarks of a mental disorder. And I'm not saying that the individuals are mentally disordered. I'm saying that collectively something very much like that is unfolding, and it could hardly be more dangerous.
It makes me think of like mob mentality or mob thought or groupthink. Where psychologically speaking, they've obviously done lots of studies on this where they show that people will act in ways they would never act alone because they're with a big group of other people. Do you think technology and social media is spreading that a little bit to where on your own in the real world, you're not going to find as many people who are willing to do crazy things, but you go online and, all of a sudden you found 100,000 people who think like you do and it emboldens you?
Oh, it's happening in many different ways. Some of them are just simply a byproduct of the technology. And as you point out, the fact that it allows people who are very rare in some regard to gather online and be reinforced by their numbers. But there's also the meddling of the tech platforms as they try to increase revenue, the meddling with their feed and search algorithms that reinforces patterns of thought that actually, under ordinary circumstances, a person might flirt with a wrong idea and then discover that it's wrong and get over it. In this case, they flirt with the wrong idea and then they get a lot of reinforcement from outside that says they're right. And this is contributing to this psychosis at an extreme level.
Yeah, I see the tech, especially the tech industry, being in between a rock and a hard place. The way that they handled, for example, the New York Post article that talked about the Hunter Biden laptop. On the one hand, they blocked it because they said for their own reasons that it was hacked information. But on the other hand, it reinforced this belief that tech is liberal biased and it's censoring conservatives. Like, where do they go from here? It seems like no matter what they do, they're either in 2016 they were getting hammered because they allowed Russia to interfere in the election. Right now they're getting hammered because it's being perceived that they're censoring conservatives. What do they do?
Well, first of all, they do seem to be censoring conservatives, but they also went after me, and I'm a liberal. What their problem with me apparently is that I'm nonpartisan. So I wasn't signed up for the plan about how we were going to, shove Trump off stage. I didn't want either of these people to win. That was apparently enough to trigger them into a censorious mode. So I think we should stop categorizing this as they have a liberal bias. It's worse than that. They have a bias toward their own corrupt elite standing in the system, and they will act in absolutely immoral ways to protect it. They also simply need to get over themselves. The idea that they think that they are in a position to judge what's factual and what's not is nonsense. This is hard enough to do when you have people with relevant expertise in an environment where they can actually argue about the details of what's true. This is not something that people inside of an opaque process in Silicon Valley are in a position to do. The only right solution is to allow people to speak. People will say wrong things. They will lie. They will do all of the things that people normally do. And we can approach it with proper caution. But what we can't do is correct for a ghost in the machine that is adjusting the way we think in ways we are not in a position to understand.
Yeah, do you, because I know they brought forth, the leaders of Twitter and Facebook before Congress. And, I think what they're trying to do is push for some kind of government regulation. Do you think that would be a good thing to allow the government to regulate these social media platforms, to watch over them, or do you think letting them be totally free would be a better idea?
Well, it's one of two possibilities, or maybe it's both. But we could have a public internet where there is a public on-ramp and some place to go in which the public square can exist with the governmental protections that come along with the First Amendment, or we can regulate these platforms as utilities and generate the protections that way. What it can't be is neither of these solutions. The current situation is appalling and very dangerous, and what has unfolded around the 2020 election should make that crystal clear.
Do you think that the media at large is acting responsibly, or do you think that they're fueling a lot of this, what's going on?
I believe they are acting in the interests of parties whose names we don't necessarily know, and they are shaping narratives, and they probably believe that they are the good guys and they are doing the right thing for the nation, but they are actually putting it in terrible jeopardy.
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do is whenever something happens nationally is I'll open up CNN and Fox, and I'll toggle between the two. And I talk about this all the time on the podcast. I recommend my whole audience do this. And I say, just go back and forth so you can see the two narratives on the same issue. It's actually it's frightening, but also remarkably fascinating. And then now I'm at the point where it's comical, where I'll see the same thing presented so differently on two different news networks. It's crazy to me. It's insane.
Well, I do the same thing. And frankly, it's not a good mechanism, but it is the only mechanism you have to control for the bias. But I will say, in this election, I didn't see it. And this may be even more frightening. So the Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, in this case, seem to be on board with the same narrative about Biden's victory. And the concern seemed to be relegated to lesser channels. And this is very troubling. It would be one thing if there was no basis for the concern, but I don't see that. When I look, I actually find reason to be troubled. And the fact that it's not being covered is worrisome.
Yeah, it's a lot of people don't realize this, but the media doesn't declare the winner of an election. They project it. And Fox and CNN kind of projected that Biden would win. But I think, what was it, yesterday or today, Real Clear Politics came out and rescinded Pennsylvania. Arizona now seems to be getting more tight. Do you think that was irresponsible of all of them to make those projections so early?
Irresponsible doesn't begin to cover it. It feels like there was a decision about what the result of the election needed to be, and whether, irrespective of what happened with the ballots and the counting, that the narrative about what had happened was going to be deployed and at full force. And, it's not the first major challenge to democracy, which I think is confusing to people. There are lots of corruptions of our democracy, most of them perfectly legal. And so we've just kind of gotten used to that challenge. But in this case, yes, it was uncanny how consistent the message was, and that it has the power to shape history, I think, is quite clear. So, I couldn't be more concerned about it.
Yeah, the thing that terrifies me is that you have media, major media outlets declaring Biden the winner when it's actually closer than that. To be fair, he's probably going to be the winner from everything that I've seen, but it's not 100%, and there is some legal battles going on. And again, Pennsylvania might not have gone to Biden. Arizona's getting a little closer. My fear is that it'll come out that wasn't the right decision, and boy, will that fuel some of the extreme left violence that we saw during the the Floyd riots and the Antifa and all that stuff, that could be very, very dangerous, and then maybe embolden the extreme right, like you said earlier.
Yes, I see that hazard very clearly. Frankly, now that we have seen the election declared by media outlets, we've seen evidence, both not very compelling and somewhat compelling, of fraud emerge. We are on a collision course with disaster, and I hope people will look into themselves and find patriotism and recognize that actually this is the moment that we all look each other in the eye and we say it is vitally important that we behave very carefully now and with all eyes on the idea of preserving the republic for future generations, because we could lose it.
Yeah, I don't think people realize that when something like a republic or democracy is destroyed, what usually emerges from the ashes is very tyrannical, very dangerous, very oppressive to people. It's never something better. It's usually something, much, much worse. So I hope people realize that.
Yeah, I mean, what I've been trying to convince people of is that even those of us who regard our system as quite unfair, and I do regard it as quite unfair, even people who believe that need to recognize that it is a very vibrant, productive system, and that the well-being that is so unfairly distributed still puts most people ahead. Even if you're on the losing end of that unfairness, this is a very free society, and there is a great deal of opportunity in it. And if you think you're going to be better off after the nation fails, you got another thing coming. And frankly, if you haven't traveled, talk to people who have, because they've probably seen what we might end up replacing this with, and it's not a step in the right direction.
No, the nothing's ever perfect, and we definitely haven't been perfect historically, and we're not perfect today. But the very things that are starting to be attacked now, free speech and elections and discourse and debate, those are the things that have always allowed us to progress. It's what gives us the ability to beat ourselves up amongst each other, not literally but figuratively, and grow. It's what got segregation to end. It's what gave women the right to vote. It's what's moved us forward. And that's the vehicle that causes real progress. We're not perfect, but if we eliminate that vehicle, where do we go? Where do we go from here?
Well, yeah, not perfect, but a slam dunk as far as the prototype goes. And the progress that we've made since the prototype was set in motion has been spectacular. Now, like others on the left, I'm frustrated that progress seems to have stalled in recent decades. But overall, we cannot be disappointed with how much we've accomplished. And this is a generational problem. I think if you're below a certain age, you may not realize how much progress was made because you may have lived in an era of relative stagnation. But wow, was that era of relative stagnation stacked on something impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very interesting times, very tumultuous. What you talk about, I echo. I say, debate, argue, that's the good part. Don't silence, don't fight, and definitely don't destroy the system that's given us the ability to do all of those things. There was a couple scenarios that I read. I don't know how accurate these are. Maybe you can help correct me, but if this does indeed get proven to be a largely fraudulent, situation with this election, either they would organize a revote or recount, which could be disastrous, or is it true that it could go to Congress for a vote, that then Congress could decide who becomes president? Yep.
There are several different scenarios that could unfold. One of the more likely ones involves neither Biden or Trump getting sufficient electoral college votes, which would send it to Congress. And, thankfully, we have a system in which the fail-safes are several deep, so that even in the event that something unprecedented unfolds here, there is some guidance on what to do. But the problem is it's also unfolding in a novel environment that the founders had no idea would exist. So the narrative shaping that's going on online and in the media potentially affects the way we understand our process writing itself.
How big of a role do you think foreign actors and players are playing in this kind of negative attitude that that we're all starting to get about each other and about the other side? Because technology and social media is making it much easier to influence Americans, and foreign governments who just want to see the fall of America or weakening of America really don't care if a Republican wins or a Democrat wins. All they care about is that we don't trust each other and that we don't trust our systems. Do you think that they're playing a big role? Do you think that they're playing both sides and just getting us to completely distrust the system, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat?
I don't want to say that I think it's happening, because I really feel like it's something that one needs evidence of before you go down that road. But I can say, if we're doing this to ourselves, it is certainly our enemies abroad who will be the beneficiaries. And that's really something we have to take into account. Americans have a bad habit of feeling like we are alone on the earth, and we're not. We have antagonists, and those antagonists are largely kept in check by the vibrant nature of our system. And if we attack it from the inside, they'll be right there to pick up the spoils.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'll speak from personal experience. I consider myself very objective. I try to check everything that I believe. I love engaging in debate with people who have opposing views, real debate, because from my perspective, either I'm proven wrong, in which case now I have the better opinion, or I strengthen my own opinion by understanding the other side much better. But I fell prey to some of this myself when a lot of the riots were going on. Earlier this year, there was a tweet that was being shared, and it said something like, once we're done with the downtown cities, we're going to be heading into the suburbs to attack all the white people in their homes. Now, I have two small children. Now I have 3 small children at home, and I immediately felt this visceral feeling of wanting to defend my family. I don't consider myself, although these days I'm probably more on the right, but I'm much more libertarian with my views. In the past, that put me more on the left. These days, it tends to put me more on the right. But I felt all of a sudden this fear, this visceral fear, and this wanting to act out, and this reaction, and so I came to work. I talked about it with my co-host, and my co-host Justin. Him and I were going back and forth, and he said, I wonder if it was people on the extreme right that put out that tweet to try to rile people up. And I thought, wow, that would be a brilliant strategy. Well, I did. I checked it out, and it turns out that was not a tweet from the extreme left saying that they were going to attack white people in their suburban homes. It was the extreme right trying to scare everybody in the suburbs to, take arms or whatever. And I fell for it for about a day or two. I was in that kind of enraged state. Do you think that's happening on both sides?
Oh, no doubt. On the other hand, the thing that you feared is also happening. So here in Portland, it is now routine for the rioters to go into residential neighborhoods to wake people up with bright lights, flashing lights, bullhorns, noisemakers, and to harass them. There's one video I saw a couple days ago. Guy with a Biden sign in his yard is being harassed by an angry mob. I believe it was in Vancouver, Washington, which is effectively a suburb of Portland. But yeah, this is happening. It's very real, and it's lethal.
Yeah, I saw. I'm in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, and we saw in San Francisco mobs of people tearing down statues, and police told to stand down. Why are and it seems to happen, and maybe this is a little media bias, maybe from the media that I'm consuming, but it seems to be happening in these Democrat-run cities where they're telling the police to stand down. Why would they do that? What's the purpose?
Well, I have to tell you, this is round 2 for me. When Evergreen melted down, that's the college I used to teach at. It melted down in large measure around accusations against me that I was a racist. The thing that the rioters pointed to was that I had opposed a day of racial segregation on the campus where white people had been asked not to show up. But in any case, the riots that unfolded in the aftermath of that involved rioters roving the campus with weapons, stopping traffic, searching apparently car to car for me. And the president of the college had ordered the campus police to stand down. They were literally locked in their police station. They phoned me up to tell me that I should stay away from campus because they couldn't protect me there. They told me that they couldn't protect me anywhere in town on my bicycle. I should basically treat this as a very dangerous, violent situation. And as much as that seemed like an extreme anomaly at the time, we've now seen experiments with anarchy in Seattle. We've seen it in Portland. You're right. It's these states in which there is no tension between right and left, where it's all the power belongs to the one side, that people live in fear of accusations of racism, and they will let violent people run roughshod over the community rather than risk being portrayed as part of the fascist enemy.
Yeah, okay, so they're just afraid that they're going to be labeled themselves racist, and so therefore let it happen.
Yeah, and I mean, we see it close up here in Portland on the riots are happening nightly. We see the political aftermath on a weekly basis, where our mayor, who is bent over backwards to make life easy on the protesters and rioters, is frequently portrayed as fascist, right-wing, and it's total nonsense. I don't know why he listens to it, because there's nothing he could do that would satisfy them. He might as well at least protect the city, but somehow he can't see past it. And we see hints of that in San Francisco. We see it in Seattle. We see it in LA. And, something's got to halt this, because it's very unstable on its own.
I feel like they're making a deal with the devil. Like, they feel like they're going to appease them. But I've seen videos where they've gone with these mayors who allow them to do these things, stand down the police. Then they go and try and find them in their own homes. So I don't get it.
They did it here in Portland. They actually literally went to the mayor's apartment building and lit a fire in the lobby, even though there were people in the building, children, I believe. So this is a dangerous kind of psychosis, and there is no appeasing them. Anybody who thinks they're going to appease them into going home should check what happened to Evergreen in the aftermath of our college president appeasing the mob we had. The college is on the verge of collapse. It's lost half its student body. The only reason it's still open is that the state is propping it up. So if you want that to happen to your city, the way to do it is to appease rioters.
It does seem like you said, almost like a mass psychosis. Like, what's the remedy? How do we work on this?
Well, unfortunately, it involves adults gathering and regaining control of the system. And I'm not sure that we have enough adults to pull it off. But the fact is, it is not going to serve the protesters. If the U.S. collapses, they will get a valuable lesson. They will discover that they had it wrong, but at what cost? So in some sense, even if you're sympathetic with the rioters, the best thing that could happen is that some adult could prevent them from destroying a system on which they are dependent. Yeah,
and it makes me think of, kind of the useful idiots that you see Marxists use in other, fallen democracies that later became tyrannical, where they'll use a group, an extremist group, to kind of be the weapon that they use to gain power. Once they gain power, they discard of them, because they throw them away because they're too, you can't control them. You got your use out of them. Now get rid of them. The irony from my perspective is, if they did get what they wanted, they'd be the first ones to be thrown in the gulags.
I agree. They are de facto useful idiots, whether or not there's a foreign power pulling the strings. They are acting as if there was, and we have to stop them.
Now, from an individual perspective, okay, what can we do for ourselves? It's very stressful. It's easy to read things that confirm your bias. The algorithms of social media point you in that direction. It feels like people are becoming more polarized, probably because they are through what's going on. Like, how can we even check ourselves? Because I find myself constantly checking myself, even after having a conversation like this. I feel myself wanting to become more extreme with my views. What are some things that we can do?
Well, I would say the key thing you can do is figure out who you can be completely honest with and protect that relationship, whatever it takes. If the relationship has to exist completely in person in order to protect it from what threatens it, then make sure it happens. So for those of us, for example, who have, a spouse with whom we have deep, important conversations and we're capable of holding each other's feet to the fire and that sort of thing, that's an incredibly valuable relationship. If you have a sibling with whom you can do that, great. If your best friend is somebody you can be completely frank with, then call them up, because the key thing is a reality check so that when they do confront you, you aren't sucked in by the sheer terror that you will be isolated if you refuse to say the right things. And so personal relationships are going to be the foundation of I hesitate to use the word resistance because that word has been captured now, but the resistance to this woke madness is going to involve people who can look each other in the eye and know what it means. Yeah, and
what's funny is unlikable as President Trump is, one thing that he's done is, he'll get called out. He doesn't apologize, and he'll just keep going, for better or for worse. I feel like, I have a podcast with a large following, and we speak what we believe to be true. We speak it often, and if it pisses a lot of people off, we will stick to our guns, because I almost feel like bowing or bending is just that'll be worse. It'll be worse than to stand your ground.
Well, I think a small number of us are discovering the path to anti-fragility. So anti-fragility, for those who are not familiar, is a Nassim Taleb concept. And what it means is something that grows stronger when challenged rather than weaker. And the problem for most people is that when they are confronted by this woke revolution, it's the first time. And so they don't have the skills built up to know what to say to confound their accusers. For those of us in the public eye, especially if we have been bold about saying what we think for some time, we've already endured a number of challenges. And to the extent that we've stayed standing, we're in a better position to speak than most. So building your own anti-fragility is a key skill for this era.
Do you think that that enough people are feeling kind of like you and I do? Maybe they're not speaking it out, but do you think that a backlash is going to start to happen where enough people say, all right, that's enough. Enough is enough with this calling everything sexist, racist, homophobes. Enough with the wokeness. Enough canceling brands because they look a particular way or because whatever. Do you think there may be a backlash growing among people who are just, not so vocal right now?
I'm afraid of the backlash. I don't want to see a backlash. I want to see a very careful, measured response, something that doesn't go too far. And that's the trick. The backlash we will get. We're already seeing it. But a measured response that allows us to regain control of the helm and steer the ship in a safe direction is key. And that's going to be difficult. Any
predictions for what you think is going to happen with this case again of fraudulent voting? And do you think it's not going to pan out? It's just more politics as usual, or do you think this may actually be contested?
Well, my concern is that the evidence that I've seen that is most compelling is statistical in nature. And that means that most people do not have the tools to evaluate even what it is evidence of. And if that were just the public, that would be bad enough. But courts are in a similar position because a court is not typically going to have a mathematically expert judge what it's going to do is it's going to have expert witnesses battle about the meaning of these subtle statistical phenomena. And it's inherently going to be muddled, which means that when a judgment is rendered, it will be rejected by a large number of people on the basis that it doesn't go in the direction they want it to go. And we will be fighting over it. So it's hard for me to see, short of clear evidence of fraud would do one thing. I don't know how you get clear evidence of no fraud. That's unfortunately difficult, even if there was no substantial fraud. But the statistical arguments, compelling as they may be, and I've seen some that I find quite disheartening, those arguments are going to be a tough sell for anybody who doesn't want to hear it because they don't have to understand.
Right. Yeah, because it's all odds and numbers, and it's like, well, that doesn't make sense to me. Right.
Well, it's, for example, things like time series that say that something odd happened in the count because a pattern that had been quite consistent and was consistent in places where no fraud has been alleged suddenly breaks and goes the other direction. And what does that actually mean? Well, sometimes it means nothing. Sometimes it means ballots from some place that voted differently because places do vote differently come in. And sometimes it does mean something. And so the problem is an argument can be mathematically very compelling and still be very hard to follow for people who aren't trained in it.
All right. Well, I hope it all works out. I definitely hope this all works out.
Yeah. Well, you and me both.
Yeah. Well, Bret, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been a great conversation. I really appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate the fact that you have the courage to speak out and be honest and to debate people and keep doing what you're doing. We love it.
Thanks, and good luck to us all.
Thanks.